So a creator on here that I truly admire and respect, the Hecataean Foodie, has been making videos that address the mother, maiden, crone. You know, the archetype, the triple goddess. I think if you have been in witchcraft spaces for any amount of time, you would have come across it. And now their argument is the exclusionary nature of maiden, mother, and crone. Where do women who can't bear children fit into that? Where do trans women fit into that? And from the source material, Robert Graves, I can completely understand that. Robert Graves was writing through the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and his work on the triple goddess were from his former years, during a time where women could not have career, where the social norm was to get married, bear children, etc., etc. So looking at that source material, you have to understand that you cannot apply the lens of modernity, your modern lens, to these kinds of historical source material, because it just won't work out. But I do feel, and this is just my personal thoughts on the matter, as I was taught quite differently about the maiden, mother, and crone, as I was taught by a woman who could not bear children, had no interest in marrying, and had a more evolved concept around these archetypes, that it wasn't exclusive to only being a maiden, a mother, a crone, but that these concepts represented different stages of our life, and this can be anyone's life. One of the concepts that we talked about at length is that maiden, mother, crone can also be representative of learning, living, and teaching. Maiden, when you are in your youth and child years, you are learning how to person, all of that stuff. Mother would be the time of your life that you are doing the living, and crone being the time in your life where you are now passing on knowledge and teaching. Another concept she had was that it was also representative of taking. In your maiden, in your childhood years, you take because you can't, sustain your own self, so you have to take. The mother being the time in life where you give, and you give, and you give, and you give more of yourself. And then the crone is a time in your life when you are sharing. You've learned that you cannot take everything. You've learned that you cannot give anything. So now you're at a point in your life where you're able to share. And these are just some of the evolved concepts of the maiden, mother, and crone that I personally feel are less exclusionary, and evolve those concepts to be more adaptable to our modern path and practice.
I can actually expand on this a bit. Hecate was absolutely one of the inspirations for Graves. And actually, one of the claims that Graves made is that every pantheon had this big three female representation of a maiden, a mother, and a crone, which is ultimately why we don't hear much about Graves anymore. His hypothesis he presented as fact, and upon peer review was debunked by primary source material. But this is certainly not the only instance of rewriting lore. For example, look at Leland's Gospel of Aradia, which features both Diana and Lucifer. And speaking of Diana, that is a goddess who has a lot of her lore muddled up, rewritten, as she was a popular figure in the 1890s and into the 1920s, as part of the Western spiritual movement of that time. Another goddess that was heavily affected by this was Isis. During this time, there was entire cults dedicated to Isis. She featured heavily in groups like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, as well as among individuals like Dion Fortune, MacGregor Mathers, and Aleister Crowley. But the rewriting of lore is something that has always happened, and continues to happen today. Today we call it fan fiction. But historically we surmise that that's just how lore was created. Stories that reach different places that have things added or taken away over time. Within the Norse mythos, the poetic Eddas were transcribed over 100 years after the last practicing Norse pagan lived. Because while Christianity was then the dominant religion, these folk tales still existed. And we have found historical artifacts to support these stories in the forms of statuettes and reliefs. As a historian, I am a big fan of primary source material, but I still have to take time to understand and respect its evolution over time. Much like my previous video, interpreting and understanding what Maiden Mother Crone can mean in our modern age. These stories, lore, mythologies, they become an amazing tapestry of culture and connection. And that is pretty amazing. So I would like to use this comment and the video thread attached to it as a jumping off point. And firstly, if you like content that is insightful, well-researched, and thought-provoking, please go give Cat and Cauldron a follow. The thread of videos attached to this pertain to the triple goddess, a topic I very recently covered and have seen many other creators begin to cover as well. The entire conversation around it, though, hammers in a point that I am very passionate about. Sort of the grand thesis of all of my study into witchcraft history. And that is the adaptability and evolution of practices. Now, as my comment on here says, Robert Graves is originator of these kind of core concepts that we have surrounding this idea of a triple goddess. However, all of his study and hypotheses were debunked for having a lack of credibility or primary source material. And while there is no basis in history for these claims, no goddess that we can directly associate with, I personally don't believe that it invalidates the entire premise. Now let me explain. Firstly, from a historical perspective, all stories start somewhere. And we do tend to fall into this trap within witchcraft, paganism, occultism, that older equates validity. And I can say with confidence after my years of study that in spiritualism, that is not always the case. Secondly, we can look at the argument from a practical point of view. As I stated in my own Triple Goddess video, which you can go and see, I do think it's an excellent representation of different stages of life, and that understanding what stage you are in and how your time on this earth can be reflected in those stages can be a very important thing to path and practice. My third argument would be on the magical side of things. There are a lot of writings and a definitive belief structure surrounding the triple goddess, giving it an egregoric value. Egregoric? Might be a word. I might have made it up. Making an egregore, or the idea that communal belief creates. Now I will say finally that Robert Graves' work absolutely deserved to be debunked. He presented his hypothesis as fact and gave misinformation and lied about historical materials in order to get his point across. Now, had he presented this as new thought, rather than trying to give it more validity through history, I think we'd be having a very different conversation. But I would love to know more thoughts in the comment. Just because Graves' work was debunked, does that then invalidate all of our information and association with a triple goddess? A vision of Maiden, Mother, and Crone? Let me know what you think.